terrorism all the time. And indeed, I saw before I retired from the business 2.5 years ago, especially after 9/11, there was this enormous surge of resources from a lot of different places, a lot of number 3, 4, and 5 issues into terrorism, and then it happened again when we invaded Iraq. And a lot of resources got swept into Iraq because there was a policy need to serve. So yes, that is a problem.
Well, Mr. Ernest, from the view of an operative yourself, do we have enough assets in places like China now?
I think I can say unequivocally no. Without knowing, the latest classified information, we are confronting a very different world than we confronted during the Cold War. You can almost look back at the Cold War with a degree of nostalgia because we knew who the enemies were. The chess pieces were more or less in place. And every once in a while there'd be little proxy wars or big ones like Vietnam. But we confronted the Soviet Union. We understood it as a state. It was different than we were, but they had a parliament, they had a head of a government, they had a military. So there was a little bit of mirror imaging in understanding them and in trying to, if you want, understand them in an intelligent sense, which involves both collection and analysis. Now we are dealing with this very different world of dispersed threats. We all recall former DCI Woolsey's statement, we have slain the dragon and now we are in a jungle filled with poisonous snakes. And in some cases they're harder to keep track of. And that's exactly what we're dealing with. We as a country, as a government, tend to have a short attention span. And so things go to what is on the front burner right now. And the things on the back burners get ignored, downgraded, the resources don't get there. So I think it goes without saying that we do not have enough assets, and I'll use that in the collection sense, agents, sources, people who advise us, probably in China and most of the countries that concern us, whether it's North Korea, other areas of the Middle East. In working against these current threats, we are working against a very different cultural grouping than we did before. We always had interest in those groups, but they're not, as the Soviets would say, the main enemy.
I could just add on this business of priorities. George Tenet, when he was still the director, often told his constituents on Capitol Hill, you want me to cover Iraq and terrorism and weapons proliferation, okay, I'll try to do that, but don't expect me to cover other things because there's going to be a real contradiction here between putting resources on those priority issues and trying to get the coverage on China and Africa. And if a coup occurs next week in Burkina Faso, don't expect me to provide an analyst that will say something smart on it.
We're going to go to a short break now, but we'll be right back with a look at allies, interrogations, and renditions. Welcome back now to the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C. for our roundtable discussion on the changing CIA. Dr. Shore, you had something you wanted to add about what the difference is between the old Cold War with the Soviet Union, which was sometimes hot in places like Vietnam, and what we're facing today.
Well, I wanted to agree with my colleagues here at the table and add just one thing. We'd never armed the Soviet Union or equipped them with weapons of mass destruction. And at the moment, our two most deadly enemies on the planet, the Chinese and the Saudis, control most of our debt. And that clearly is a weapon of mass destruction for the United States. We have also discarded all of the technology controls we had during the Cold War. And everybody from China to Osama bin Laden now have state-of-the-art communications, which we denied to the Soviets, but now allow to flow freely to all our other enemies.
You mentioned Saudi Arabia as an enemy. They're listed as an ally of the United States.
Again, sir, our political class in this country holds hands with King Abdullah, or before him, King Fahd, and the Saudis have us by the proverbial neck. They control oil production, own a great deal of our debt, and we tend to forget, because our leaders don't talk about it, and the Saudis can hire masterful public relations people in the United States, that Osama bin Laden and his ilk are not aberrations for Saudi society. They are the poster boys for the education system the Saudis have produced. So when President Bush or Mr. Clinton hold hands with King Abdullah and walk through the Rose Garden, they're walking through the Rose Garden with a man whose government is funding the export of a brand of Islam that's far more militant, military, and anti-Christian and anti-Western than anything Osama bin Laden represents. They are undermining us at home and abroad. And because we are dependent on oil and their investments in our country, we have to identify them as a friend, even as they try to destroy us.
I'll come back to you for a moment, Dr. Cochran. Waterboarding. Legal, illegal, under the Clinton administration, Bush administration, or both?
We didn't hold anyone under the Clinton administration, Mr. Rather, so we never interrogated them directly ourselves. Clearly, waterboarding is a process, if we indeed used it, which General Hayden says we did, that was approved by the United States government, by every legal authority that had a say in intelligence operations and covert operations. It was likewise not objected to, at least, by the Congress. Covert action is briefed to both intelligence committees. They cannot say they didn't know about it, although they do say that. And General Hayden has said it was an effective technique in producing intelligence. So I have to say that America is better off for having used that practice than it would be if we had simply walked away from it.
Doctor, the European Union is seeking answers from Poland and Romania regarding their role in aiding what's called extraordinary renditions in the period 2002 to 2003. What about rendition or renditions?
I had the honor to manage that program for about 40 months, and I think it's been a spectacularly successful program. We have never tortured anyone. There has been no...
Wait a minute, we've never tortured anyone?
Never tortured anyone. Unless you assume the United States government under two presidents deliberately ordered us to torture someone. It was never done. The program was approved by Mr. Clinton, Mr. Clinton's Department of Justice, and by Mr. Bush, Mr. Bush's Department of Justice, not to mention an endless cavalcade of CIA lawyers who are really co-conductors of clandestine activity these days. I think the problem is more in the nature of the enemy than it is with the process. This is the first time the United States and our presumed Western allies have ever fought an enemy where you can probably never release the people that you capture. We have seen, for example, people being released out of Guantanamo Bay, up to 4 dozen now that they know of, have gone immediately back to the battlefield in Afghanistan or Iraq, and we've either killed them there or captured them again.
Is this a fact?
This is a fact. And the reality is that we and the Europeans end up yelling at each other about rendition. I think perhaps these people should be prisoners of war in the traditional sense, but we really do have a problem. For example, right now, Mr. Rather, when they put Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Tawfiq bin Attash and the rest of the boys in Guantanamo on trial, if they find them innocent, they're not going to release them because they'll go back to planning 9/11 or something else all over again. So this is a very unique problem in Western history, and we really haven't talked about it realistically yet.
As far as you want
I'm
to...
just going to add a point, and that is that rendition is not new with the so-called war on terrorism. I mean, it goes back, we were talking earlier, I think at least to the Civil War, and it really is a form, an international form of what we all recognize in this country as the doctrine of hot pursuit. I think every state in the Union recognizes that. It just happens to be that we're crossing international lines instead of state lines.
Well, excuse me, it'd be one thing if we were crossing international lines
Yes.
to capture these people, but as I understand it, when we go to a rendition, we're talking about, if not torture, something that puts the pressure on them to give up information.
But it is, I think what I'm getting at, and I would defer to Mike to comment on that, but it is going after people who clearly are antithetical to the United States. They've either clearly done harm to the United States, they're involved in activities which cause harm, and we're going after them. In some cases, bringing them back here, in some cases, delivering them to other countries. But that's what I was getting at, is this doctrine of going out of people who have declared themselves your enemy and are taking action in that regard.
When you were in charge of rendition, did you send people to Egypt Poland, Romania, other places because we didn't want to do it here?
No, sir. We sent them to other places because President Clinton and Mr. Berger and Mr. Clark wanted us to take them there. We told the president that we were taking these people to places that his own State Department was going to identify as human rights abusers. And they got puckered up and they were a little afraid. And then they said to us, will these countries guarantee to treat them according to their own laws? And we said, yeah, we're pretty sure that they'll treat them according to their own laws. And that's the way it was. Under Mr. Clinton's administration, we didn't hold people. They were given to other countries where there was a legal process outstanding. And from the American perspective, the idea that we could have picked someone up and sent him to a country because we had a hunch that he knew something it's an impossibility.
That was during the Clinton years.
During the Clinton or during the Bush years. You had to build a dossier of material that indicated either previous activities in this area or intention to conduct operations against the United States. I can say, Mr. Rather, from the American perspective, there were only two goals when we drafted the rendition program. The first was to get somebody off the street that was a threat to the United States or our allies, and second, to grab from them at the moment of their arrest whatever documents they had, either hard copy documents or electronic documents. Interrogation was never a priority when the program was first put into place, and certainly could not have been justified as the reason for picking someone up.
Dr. Spiller, you had something you wanted to contribute on this.
It's unfortunate. There's a whole constellation of issues here that have been confused with each other. Rendition, quite simply, is the transfer of a suspect from the custody of one country to another without going through a long, formal, and often difficult extradition process. It's been confused with these other issues, like how are detainees handled, the whole torture issue, the issue of who should have been and should not have been scarfed up and landed in Guantanamo in the first place. And many of those people, beyond the hardcore terrorists, are ones who simply were scraped up on the battlefield, and probably, if they were to be held, should be treated as prisoners of war. And then there's the whole issue of the judicial or quasi-judicial proceedings, whether those military tribunals are really going to be sound or not. These are all distinct issues, and it's unfortunate that we've tended to confuse many of these with the basically very simple idea of rendition.
Well, that's an excellent point. And journalists, and I do not accept myself in this criticism, I think you've had a part of that, of just putting it all under rendition.
Right.
And you say we need to think these things in separate categories.
That's right.
We'll be back in just a moment with the question, intelligence and policy. Where should the line be drawn? Welcome back to the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C. for our roundtable discussion on the changing CIA. Doctor, you spoke earlier about policy and how policy is different from intelligence. And when a policy decision is made, it isn't just the Intelligence Committee that's informed about it. The whole administration is informed about it. The State Department is informed about it. Where does the State Department fit in? Is their position of influence holding steady, increasing, or declining?
The State Department is the essential diplomatic arm of the government. Many people within the State Department serve as de facto foreign policy makers insofar as they are advising the President. And insofar as the President doesn't get involved in certain decisions, the Department is a policy-making arm itself. One of the problems with the Department of State, however, is that its institutional culture is such that it is much more a kind of a department of diplomacy rather than an overall department of integrated foreign policy and national strategy. And these things are extremely powerful instruments of American statecraft, which are and ought to be integrated, for example, with intelligence. When you have relations with foreign religious figures, with editorial boards, with business leaders, with labor leaders, with all sorts of other influentials, cultural figures, you are able to have your finger on the pulse of what's going on in those countries. You develop personal relationships of trust with them, which can eventually translate into intelligence relationships. You can be involved in influencing public opinion of foreign countries, but the department does not have an influence culture, and neither, by the way, does the intelligence community.
Let's move you, Dr. Pello. We were talking about where policy and intelligence intersect. I think a lot of people have the view that intelligence now forms the policy. Is that a misrepresentation?
That's a gross misrepresentation, both in theory and in practice. I mean, in theory, the way things should work is intelligence is one of those sources of input, of facts, of analysis, of information. Only one, not the only one, into the policymaking process to try to inform it. It is not the role of intelligence, nor should it be, to recommend particular options or particular policies. I think there is a larger perception out there that indeed intelligence has a much bigger role over policy than it does. We only have to look at the recent episode of the Iraq War and the decision to invade in March 2003, with all of the attention over the unhappy story of errors on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. But that didn't drive the decision at all. And in fact, the decision was made in the face of and contrary to some of the judgments that the intelligence community made, particularly with regard to terrorist connections and with regard to Iraq being not even close to a nuclear weapon, that sort of thing. So it's unfortunate that that perception is the case, because it affects not only how the public views intelligence, but also it affects our understanding and really our misunderstanding of what goes into policy.
Let's talk about covert action. Start with you, Mr. Ernest. You've actually done it. You've run it.
Well, covert action is often misunderstood. Covert simply means secret, doesn't it? But we use the word covert action really to cover what I think John was referring to earlier as influence operations. Influence in a simple sense might be an election, it might be influencing public opinion, but the characteristic of covert action is that it's covert, it's secretly done. Now, a lot of covert actions have become public. There was a book just published called The Mighty Wurlitzer, which was all about CIA's covert actions during the Cold War to confront the Soviet propaganda machine, because they had youth fronts and union fronts and fronts of lawyers and so forth. And we wanted to give the Americans and the West generally a chance to answer that. And in doing that, we subsidized many movements. In many, many cases, we didn't try and manipulate it or control it. We weren't puppet masters. We were making it possible, Westerners, Americans, to enter that arena. And covert action covers that kind of thing.
But Doctor, do you or do you not agree that with many people, when you say covert action, they think of Green Berets dropping into some strange place or the SEALs climbing ashore? But from what I've heard around this table, that's not the case.
Well, it's not always the case, Mr. Rather. I think Mr. Ernest has described a great deal of what covert action is, but there is a lethal aspect to covert activities, and I, over the course of my career, I worked to support the Afghan Mujahideen and then to work against Sunni extremists, and so I think the lethal aspect of covert action is a very important one. I think the agency does it as well as it can be done. We can always do better. But in terms of, again, as Mr. Ernest said, being nimble and being timely, we're far better at covert action in the lethal sense than the military is, for example. I think there has been a trend among presidents from both parties to be reluctant to use the U.S. military as it can be used, to the extent it can be used. And they have fallen back, I think, too much on covert action lethal programs to substitute for war, to try to bring victory to America. And in most cases, lethal covert action programs can be a complement to war fighting, but they can't be a substitute for conventional war fighting.
Well, Dr. Pillar, picking up on that, what about the perception, at least, that the CIA gets into turf wars of a sort with the military? Mm-hmm. Let's take a situation in Western Pakistan. A target is identified by the CIA, let's say by a drone. Who makes the decision, whether the CIA moves on that target or they say, thank you very much for the information, we're going to have the military guys do that? And if they decide to let the military do it, does or does not the military's understandable aversion to casualties sometimes make them more conservative, if we can use that word, than the CIA would be?
Well, first of all, if we're talking about covert action still, we should make it clear to the audience this is all taking place under the terms of top-level policy decisions. You can't do anything in terms of covert action except under the terms of a covert action finding, which has been signed by the President of the United States.
He has to sign off on it.
He has to sign it. These always go through extensive consideration among the policy seniors before he signs it, as well as drafts going back and forth between the White House and CIA if they're going to implement it. And then it has to be briefed to selected members of Congress on the intelligence committees. So it's not a matter of either the Army or other parts of the military or the CIA sort of going off and doing their own thing. Now, once the thing is signed and the order has gone out and the President has determined that, well, we're going to use the CIA to do this or we're going to use the military to do that, then it becomes a matter of coordination in the field. And the sorts of situations that you talk about, the coordination becomes extremely important. The ambassador in the country in question, the CIA station chief in the country in question, and whatever military command involved, if the military are doing this, all have to be very involved and wired together. Doesn't mean it always happens perfectly, but that's the execution phase of it after the President has approved it.
A lot of people have seen Charlie Wilson's War recently, read the book, seen the film. Our support, that is CIA's support, when we say CIA, that's the U.S. government, but through the arm of CIA acting covertly, supported the Mujahideen, who eventually drove the Soviets out. That was a covert action. And in fact, I was with the Inspector General's staff and went out and inspected it in the early days. We were then delivering weapons out of the trunks of cars. But that was a covert action. For one reason or another, it became publicized. Now, they often say that the ship of state leaks from the top. And of course, the administration became very proud of that action. And it was a great success over the Soviets. It was, some people said, their Vietnam. It was the beginning of the end. But that is a very good example of what Michael was talking about. There is a lethal aspect. As long as I was in the CIA, since 1957, we always had a paramilitary arm, and it was used to greater or lesser degree. Obviously today, because of the nature of threat, it's being used to a greater degree.
I want to move on, but before doing so, Doctor, I want to give you a chance to lean in on this covert action.
Well, I believe that for a very long time, probably since the Church and Pike Committee hearings in the 70s, our intelligence community has been severely constrained from taking a lot of action in the realm of political influence. And I think it's a great big mistake on the part of our national decision-making authorities to have exited this field. And today, I believe in our intelligence community, there is a great lack of institutional memory of how to do these things in an effective way. There are many people who are very fastidious here in Washington who say that political action, ideological warfare, political warfare are dirty things, that we don't want to get this dirt under our fingernails. But as one of my colleagues here on the Institute of World Politics faculty likes to say, if you think those things are dirty, then what that means is you'd rather kill somebody rather than persuading them. You'd rather kill somebody rather than discredit them. And we need to learn how to master these various non-military arts. And some of them have to be done secretly. The war of ideas, for example, is not between Islam and the American concept of freedom. The war of ideas, in my book at least, is between those Muslims who want their faith to be fundamentally a religion versus people who have a political ideology and give it a radical religious gloss.
Such as Osama bin Laden.
Like Osama bin Laden and others, some of these Shiites. And how does the United States affect an intra-Islamic conflict, which is going on in many parts of the world? It's going on in Indonesia and